Hi everyone, my name is Aoife Delarty-Lowe and I'm the Director of Law School Engagement and Advocacy at Equal Justice Works. Welcome back to another instalment of My Impact. This time we're speaking with Jean-Luc Adrien, who is a 2018 Equal Justice Works Fellow. We're here to talk about Jean-Luc's experience as a Fellow, his public interest career, and hopefully inspire some law students who are interested in public interest law along the way. Jean-Luc, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't we start from the very beginning? Why public service? Why did you end up going to law school?
Sure, that's a really great question, and I think it's a very personal one for me that kind of bleeds into a personal story. I was born in Haiti. Into my personal story, I was born in Haiti. Grew up there until I was about 10 or 11 years old, and so for me, growing up, it was a privilege to grow up in a country where 90+% of the population was Black. And so my race was never really something that I had to think about, except in terms of the history books, as like the first free Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. So it was, needless to say, kind of a shock, a culture shock in many ways to come to the United States when I was 11, specifically to Miami. And, it became something that I noticed. I think the first memory that I have of it is in the early 2000s, Florida had, the state educational assessment that they gave to middle schoolers and high schoolers was the FCAT. And after every year, the numbers would come out and it would be broken down by demographics. And I often saw that Black students scored on the lower end of the spectrums. And, that's something that really marked me at like 11, 12 years old. Never really having experienced, there are a lot of inequalities in Haiti, but never really just broken down by race, race-based inequalities. Colorism is a reality, is a sad reality in Haiti, but not to the extent of race-based inequalities as exists in the United States. And then, later on through my education, I kind of like saw this pop up over and over again. When I was lucky enough to make it, or blessed enough to make it to honors classes, I was often one of the few Black students. When I saw students being suspended or in detention, the rumor mill at school went on. It was almost always Black or Latino students. And so, that then became a part of my reality that for the first 10, 11 years of my life didn't exist. So it was really stark to me. Later on, when I got into more advanced classes in high school, we learned stats like one that stayed with me from, 15 years ago, and it's still kind of the same, is that Black people make up 13% of or around 13% of the US population, but or triple that in the prison population, around 40%. And so that, along with, some experiences that I had as a teenager, being, pulled over by the police when I was jogging, it kind of created like a weird anxiety and fear in me growing up. And that was something that I didn't want to live with. So I kind of wanted to turn that fear into like it became kind of a sense of duty. And so I was like, I didn't know it was called a public defender back then, but I was like, I'm going to be a lawyer that defends people. And so that became my route into public interest from my teenage years on.
Wow, thank you so much for telling us that. That was a really profound story. Thank you for that. So you go to law school knowing that you want to do public interest law. What was your first job out of law school? Was it the Bronx Defenders?
It was. And, it's funny, as I talked about, education with the FCAT and stuff like that, before law school, I taught in the Mississippi Delta for 2 years. And, based on that experience, I was lucky enough to get a scholarship in law school and for tuition. But the catch, you could say, but for me, it wasn't so much, was that for the first 3 years of my, I guess, career, I would have to provide direct legal services, but they had to be civil, based on the Yeah, and so that's why. So I ended up at the Bronx Defenders, doing family defense, so representing parents who are accused of abuse and neglect. So in those kinds of proceedings in the Bronx, and so that was civil, but I was still a public defender. And so that was like kind of the perfect job for me with those circumstances. And you know, it was a really, really great place to start my career as a young lawyer. Amazing training, amazing people. So it's kind of a dream job, yes.
So you ended up, after the Bronx Defenders, serving as an Equal Justice Fellow in the Disaster Recovery Legal Corps. How did that transition come about? How did you hear about the Corps, and what brought you back to Miami?
Sure. So, you know, that transition was serendipitous in a way. I always knew the plan was always to come back to Miami, well, to South Florida. I work in Miami, but I live in Broward County, which is just north of Miami. The plan was always to come back. So I was like, you know what, I'm gonna get 3 years doing this PD stuff in the Bronx, and then, you know, home is where the heart is, and so I got to go back home, and do it on the criminal side, you know, as after my I guess, you know, the scholarship requirement or whatnot. But that timeline got fast forwarded, you know, a little bit outside of my control due to like some family stuff that I had to attend to within 1 year of my law school graduation. And so having to do that, I reached out to having to make, you know, that move. You know, family is always first for me. And so once that whole situation happened, I was lucky enough to speak with my 1L internship supervisors, who are the co-directors of the Community Justice Project in Miami. And they were like, well, you know, I know you're, you know, this is going on with your family. We're your CJP family. And so we've heard of this opportunity. We just got in our email. Do you want to apply for this? Let's apply for this together. And so we did. And, you know, like I said, serendipitous, like things outside of the law happened that brought me back home quicker than expected. And I was lucky enough to, you know, I never dreamed that I would be an EJW fellow. And I got that experience, and that was like a really, you know, bittersweet but very sweet kind of move back home, being able to do that on the wings of EJW.
So in twofold, you kind of got to go home twice. You got to come back to Florida, but you also got to come back to the Community Justice Project. What was that relationship like for the 2 years? What did you learn from that experience?
For sure. Oh my God. You know, I'm so glad that you said that, because, you know, like I said before, if we're looking at it chronologically, I was like, yes, I want to be a lawyer who defends, you know, people against the state, you know, the immense power of the state. But mostly all of that happens in the courtroom. And, you know, that was my conception of what lawyering was, right? And, you know, but it was always somewhat at odds with, you know, what you see in the real world, that like, you know, maybe I know in the federal context, it's like what 2% of cases go to trial. On different state levels, it's like less than 10% as well. And so you know that there's a huge chunk of people that don't really, of like people that fall through the cracks, so to say, to use, you know, like an overused phrase, but there are ways to create change outside of the courtroom as well. And that was something that I learned and during my 1L summer. And I was so lucky to learn it early on in law school, because, you know, that 2015 summer like completely changed the way I viewed the law and how I approached law school for my 2L and 3L years. Because I learned about community organizing. I learned about, which was something I was kind of aware of, having, you know, lived in Mississippi and then Delta for 2 years, which has like a long and rich history of civil rights activism and like real community organizing. for like a rich, very rich legacy of that. But like really, lawyers don't really usually think about that side of things. So, it was coming back and, learning throughout my 1L summer as a student. That's one thing that I really, really enjoyed during my 2 years at the fellowship, was that I felt like a student again. We often had conversations, we, did readings together, and kind of like debated a lot in the office, and kind of sharpened our views, our political views and stuff throughout the 2 years, and in addition to lawyering. So I really, really enjoyed that.
So the bulk of your work during that fellowship was assisting communities in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? What was like a normal day for you?
Sure. It was, I don't think there was a normal day, right? And I think because the Community Justice Project, their model is community lawyering or movement lawyering model, which means that our clients are not individuals, or rarely individuals, sometimes are, but oftentimes they're groups of people who see an issue and want to act on the issue. And, as lawyers, we can kind of like, it's like driving a car, right? Like we can kind of look at the, what do you call that manual that no one ever looks at, that's in the glove box? Like that's what lawyers do. And, the folks in the community kind of drive the car. They're like, okay, so this is push to start. Okay, that's a new thing. Like, let's do that and drive the car. In a much more eloquent way, Ella Baker, who was a community organizer, said that people under the heel should lead. So the people who are most directly impacted by issues should be the ones leading, because, whatever solution you come up with, they are the most vested folks in having a good solution. So those are the voices that should be amplified. And so our job as lawyers was to kind of to really navigate that line, understand that we had immense privilege. And when we're in a room, oftentimes, even if you hadn't passed the bar yet, or had just passed the bar, people would still be, oh, you went to law school, you're a lawyer, cool. And then there'd be a lot of deference, and a lot of, a lot would be lost in that if we took up too much room. So I think, to answer your question, which I kind of forgot because I went on this aside. So what was the work that I did? So no one day was similar. So you would think that assisting folks after a hurricane is doing FEMA appeals, or like a land title, like HBA loans, like that kind of stuff, which is very important work, and like very, very important work because it has direct impact on people's lives. But I think I came back to Miami, maybe, what was it? So Irma happened in September, and I moved back in May, June. So that was like over 8 months later. So a lot of that work had been taken care of really diligently by one of the legal services organization down here called Legal Services of Greater Miami. They took a huge chunk of that work. But then what remained was, those billions of dollars that came down from the federal government down to the state of Florida, the Department of Economic Opportunity, which has now been made famous by the way that they've handled the unemployment claims during COVID in Florida, like an infamous, I guess. So not in a good way. And so we had to really, like, this is very wonky stuff that no one, like, who knew that Congress passes an appropriation and gives money to the states, and then the state has like a department that then creates an action plan. So like just navigating all of that. And we had groups that were really interested and that were really organizing and had meetings within communities most directly impacted by the hurricane. And our job was to, along with them, work with them to educate folks and kind of figure out, strategize with the organizers, way to kind of address those issues on a policy level for that disbursement and anything that would come afterwards. And then another thing too, we wanted to be mitigative, right? I don't know if that's a word, but we wanted to mitigate the effects of future hurricanes, because as we know with climate change, they're going to keep coming and they're going to be stronger. And so if you look at the situation in Houston, one great thing about this program was that we were a core, and we had folks in Texas and folks in Florida, and I was one of the Florida fellows. And we were able to see that the situation with Hurricane Harvey in Houston was flooding was really like the main issue. It's not so much, I mean, of course people suffered through wind damage, but flooding was really what created a huge like swath of destruction. So in Florida, we thought about that, and we had organizers had for a couple of years noticed that developers were gentrifying neighborhoods, historically Black neighborhoods, that at one point that weren't near the beach. Because like the prime real estate in South Florida, as you know, is like closer to the beach. Like that's amazing. Historically Black neighborhoods were further inland and also happened to be at higher elevation. And now developers were coming back, this gentrification trend that's going on throughout the country, developers were coming into those neighborhoods and developing, gentrifying them, raising the rent to like triple numbers of what people are earning. But those neighborhoods are at higher elevation. So when you gentrify those neighborhoods, where are the people going to go? At places at lower elevation, where they're more susceptible to flooding, any flooding that might happen in the future. So it was kind of our, to mitigate those kind of things was to help community organizations that came to us and that had been fighting against these gentrification like projects for years, and to fight against what they dubbed climate gentrification. And so that was also another thing that's been ongoing and that I did for the 2 years, where there was representing people or appealing decisions and things of that nature. So that was the myriad of ways amongst other things.
Really important work that you've been doing. So thank you for explaining the bulk of the work, and that the term climate gentrification is something that I had never heard before. So thank you for explaining that. Do you have a memorable story or a client story that you can think of during those 2 years?
So I think the biggest thing for me was, in terms of story, was property was not my favorite class in law school. And neither was it my favorite subject on the bar. I was lucky enough, and after taking the New York and Florida bar, I don't think I had a property question on either of those. Like I think I remember. But one thing that I can say, because I know there's some students who will probably be watching this, and some young lawyers as well, as I'm still very much considered a young lawyer. But one lesson that I learned is to kind of like step outside of your comfort zone. I think somebody that we all look up to in the legal field, Brian Stevenson always mentions that, we should get uncomfortable, not specifically in this context or in other ways, but I think the lesson applies that, sometimes it's not, as an attorney, the little narrow field of what you want to do, like I'm this kind of lawyer, let me be like, hey, I can represent you in this case, or in this way, let me tell you about all these benefits, like FEMA benefits, unemployment insurance. Like it's not just standing in your little lane, but really listening to what people need. And when people in the community come and tell you, like, there's this thing that's happening, how can we stop it? Even if it feels very uncomfortable, and property and land use were not your favorite subjects, and to actually kind of get uncomfortable and kind of like go down that path with folks, because we're immensely privileged as attorneys or law students, soon to be attorneys. And so I think that's one of the the best stories. I think, you know, it was very scary litigating in that field, or working in that field. And but I think that's one of the things I'm proudest of, in those 2 years, is to have gotten uncomfortable. And yeah.
That's really good advice for students. I appreciate that. So what does the future look like for you, Jean-Luc?
So the future looks like for me. So thankfully, I'm lucky enough to have to have received and accepted an offer at the public defender's office, in Miami. Exactly. So I'm really, really happy, to be starting there soon, and continuing on my journey of, that, you know, so many years ago I kind of embarked on.
That's fantastic news. Congratulations. I'm so delighted for you.
Thank you.
Well, I think this was a really, really fantastic conversation. I learned a lot. I really appreciate you taking the time out to do this. So thank you again for all your work, and thank you for becoming an Equal Justice Works Fellow.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been, a privilege to be a fellow, and it's really helped a lot in the past 2 years.